It's 2 a.m. on a dead stretch of highway in 1974. You're a black man alone in the cab of a Kenworth W900, hauling 40 tons of freight through the Deep South. You haven't stopped in nearly 200 miles. You couldn't. The diner up ahead didn't serve people who looked like you, and the truck stop after that had already banned black drivers a year before. So you drive on an empty stomach. Suddenly, red and blue lights flash in your mirrors. But you know you weren't speeding. You had heard the stories of a traffic stop turned into a fabricated citation, a fine you couldn't afford to fight, or worse, stories that never made it into any newspaper at all. You are alone with a trooper who holds every card in a county where the law and the threat wear the same uniform. The patrolman pulling you over knows you're exhausted. He knows you can't exactly walk into the local diner to ask for help. But most importantly, he knows you are carrying hundreds of dollars in raw cash to pay for diesel fuel. This isn't a traffic stop. It's a legalized shakedown. But you aren't as alone as you look. Bolted under your dashboard is a small radio, barely bigger than a shoebox, that had already told you what kind of night this was going to be. A stranger's voice 2 hours earlier had warned you exactly where this trooper liked to park. To survive the highways of the 1970s, black truck drivers didn't rely on the law. They relied on a $150 box and built an underground surveillance network that completely outsmarted the police. To understand how a cheap radio became a matter of life and death, you have to look at the money. In the 1970s, long-haul trucking was a gold rush. It was one of the few industries where a black worker without a college degree could make serious, life-changing money. We are talking the modern equivalent of $130,000 a year. If a driver was willing to run brutal hours, keep a diesel engine running, and hit delivery deadlines, he could buy a home, put children through school, and build absolute financial independence. But that independence had a deadly catch. Earning that money came with a cost specific to the driver's race. It meant driving an 18-wheeler straight through what historians call sundown towns. Interstate routes ran directly through parts of the country where Jim Crow had faded on paper, but never left in practice. Places where black people were expected by ordinance or by violent custom to be gone before dark. These were rural counties, where racist locals and corrupt sheriffs effectively made the rules. Diners refused service. Motels turned drivers away at the counter. Gas station restrooms were sometimes locked to black customers entirely. The system was designed to keep a driver terrified, isolated inside the cab, and moving. Pulling over to check a tire or use a restroom in the wrong county could cost a man his life. Then, the trap snapped shut. In October 1973, an oil embargo tied to the Arab-Israeli war sent fuel prices soaring and left gas stations running dry. Within months, President Nixon signed a federal law capping highway speeds at 55 miles per hour. This limit hit professional truckers, who were paid by the mile especially hard. For a trucker, driving 55 miles an hour means you are actively bleeding money. Corrupt police departments saw an opportunity, and they weaponized that new speed limit. They set up bogus speed traps in the middle of nowhere, specifically targeting black drivers. They knew these men had strict deadlines and pockets full of fuel money. Police departments treated minor traffic stops as a pretext, particularly against black motorists. A white driver stopped in one of these places typically faced at worst a fine and a delay. A black driver in the same seat faced a far less predictable outcome. The police used their badges to drain bank accounts, writing fake safety violations to keep drivers in their place. This is what turned an ordinary trucker habit into a survival tool, getting enough warning to avoid the stop altogether. So the drivers fought back. They needed a way to act as scouts for each other, without the police catching on. The answer was the Citizens Band radio. Before the Citizens Band radio became common equipment, black drivers relied on an older, slower network. Information passed hand to hand and mouth to mouth. A warning shared at a loading dock, a tip traded at a truck stop, a route recommended by a cousin who had made the same run the year before. Printed guides like the Green Book tried to solve a version of this problem, listing hotels and restaurants where black travelers could stop without fear. But it was also a book, printed once a year, describing a country that changed month to month. The weakness in this system was timing. A warning existed only after someone had already lived through the danger and lived long enough to pass it along. What drivers needed was a way for a warning to reach the next truck before it arrived. The FCC had opened the ban for public use decades earlier, and by the early 1970s, truck stops across the country were selling CB units to any driver willing to spend a little extra for peace of mind. Drivers running the same interstate told each other which stations still had diesel during fuel shortages, and warned of ice or a jackknifed rig blocking a lane ahead. For white drivers, the CB radio was a fun way to pass the time or avoid traffic. But for black drivers, it was a lifeline. The absolute genius of the CB radio was every driver on the CB went by a handle instead of a real name, a chosen nickname that built anonymity into the network by default. A corrupt cop sitting in a speed trap might be listening to the same channel, but he had no way to know whether a given voice belonged to a white driver, a black driver, or anyone in particular. He had no idea if the guy calling himself Night Rider was a white cowboy or a black man warning the entire highway about the trap. What set the black CB community apart wasn't a separate slang but a separate purpose behind the same tools. Black CB operators had been organizing through their radios since at least 1959. That year, a group called the Rooster Channel Jumpers formed a nationwide network with groups in major cities across the North, South, and East. By the late 1970s, the group had grown to about 10,000 members and brought them together for a national convention in Dallas. But they couldn't just say, "The police are hiding here." The cops would hear it. So they engineered a tactical language. It sounded like pure nonsense to an outsider, but delivered perfect, military-grade intelligence to other truckers. Truckers built a working vocabulary, mostly to keep transmissions short on a crowded channel. Terms like Smokey for a police officer and Channel 19 became the standard highway frequency, and every black and white trucker used it. But the warnings were exact. It meant a cop was running a radar gun at mile marker 42. A bear in the air meant a police helicopter was clocking speeds from the sky. An Evel Knievel meant a motorcycle cop was hiding on the on-ramp. It was a real-time, invisible green book. The system worked because it was relentlessly practical. A driver turned away from a diner or watching a trooper set up behind a sign a few miles back could key his microphone and put that information out within seconds. Any driver listening within range, sometimes 10 or 15 miles in open country, heard it immediately and could repeat it down the line. A single warning could travel 50 or 100 miles in a fraction of the time it took to drive that distance. If a diner actually served a black driver a hot meal without harassment, he broadcast the coordinates. If a way station was actively targeting black drivers, the warning was dropped over the frequency. The information covered nearly everything a driver needed to survive a long haul. Aggressive police in a particular county, where to find fuel during a shortage, where a mechanic could fix a blown gasket without asking questions, or where the road was iced over. A driver approaching an unfamiliar stretch at midnight might already know before he saw a single road sign, which exit to take and which to avoid. This changed the basic structure of the danger. A hazard found by one driver became knowledge shared by dozens who would never meet him. The highway stopped being something each man survived alone and became something a community watched together. They were literally escorting each other through hostile territory without ever looking each other in the eye. But they didn't just talk, they mobilized. If a driver had to cross through a notoriously dangerous county, he didn't cross it alone. As the network matured, it became protection in numbers, not just a warning system. A driver entering a stretch of highway with a bad reputation could use the radio to check whether other trucks were headed the same way. Using the radio, drivers would link up, 4, 10, sometimes 20 trucks running tight in a massive line, falling into a loose formation rather than passing through separately. This wasn't a coordinated underground organization with a rule book. It was simpler. A group of trucks made a harder target than one black trucker alone. This wasn't just a parade, it was a tactical shield. If a corrupt sheriff tried to pull over one black driver for a shakedown, the entire convoy pulled over with him. It sent a very clear physical message to the police. If you mess with one of us in the dark, you have to deal with all of us. If a driver ran into trouble with a local officer, nearby trucks could hear it happening and choose to pull over as witnesses or simply make their presence known. One truck could be isolated and dealt with quietly. a cluster of trucks. Radios crackling was a far more complicated problem for anyone counting on a driver being alone. So why isn't this taught in history books? Because by the late 1970s, the establishment realized how cool this underground network was, and they stole it. That surge in CB popularity didn't stay confined to professional drivers for long. Hollywood saw the massive convoys. They heard the incredible slang. In 1975, a novelty song called Convoy, built around the sound of truckers talking over CB radio, reached #1 on the national charts. In 1977, Smokey and the Bandit, a film about outrunning the highway patrol with CB warnings, made $300 million and became one of the year's highest-grossing movies. Within a few years, terms like Smokey had gone from working trucker shorthand to phrases nearly every American recognized. The version of CB culture that reached mainstream America kept nearly every surface detail of the original network and discarded almost all of its context. Part of why this specific history is hard to trace comes down to the radio itself. A CB transmission existed for the length of time it took to speak it, then vanished with nothing recorded or filed anywhere. The network that protected thousands of black drivers left almost no paper trail beyond scattered records from organizations like the Rooster Channel Jumpers. Hollywood left the opposite kind of trail. Films, hit songs, and television are built to be recorded and preserved. Decades later, that entertainment version survived in a form anyone could still watch, while the lived experience behind it had nowhere permanent to live except in the memories of the drivers who used it. The driver on that dark Mississippi highway made it through that stop. The warning that reached him 2 hours earlier gave him just enough time to slow down before the trooper ever caught him speeding, leaving nothing for a ticket to hang on. The radio didn't end the discrimination that made that drive dangerous in the first place. It didn't make sundown towns disappear or stop corrupt officers from targeting drivers by the color of their skin. What it gave those drivers was something they had never had before: information about danger. It is easy to look back at the 1970s and think the CB radio was just a noisy pop culture trend, like disco or bell-bottoms. But the next time you see a vintage movie with a trucker using slang over the airwaves, remember the truth. That wasn't just idle chatter. It was a brilliant, invisible communication network. The CB radio didn't end racism on America's highways, but it gave black truckers something they desperately needed: a way to look out for each other when no one else would. A small radio turned lonely highways into a connected network and helped drivers survive one dangerous mile at a time. If you want to hear more forgotten stories like this, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more history hiding behind the roads we drive every day.